I now have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Kim Stanford. Dr. Stanford is a research scientist with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry based in Lethbridge. She started her career working as a sheep and goat specialist, later as a sheep research scientist. Her first mortality composting studies were with sheep and lambs. After BSE hit, she started working on composting to handle cattle mortalities. She is also currently investigating allowable limits for cereal ergot in diets for feeder lambs. So Kim, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Robin. And okay, show my screen, got it. And I will now try to bring up my PowerPoint. Hey, it's working. Slideshow from beginning. Okay, here we go. I think we're ready to roll. Apologies to Monty Python for this little joke, but I always find it quite amusing. Not quite dead yet, but feeling better. So before we get started, first thing I'd like to do is to ask everyone a question just to judge where everyone is kind of coming from. Have you ever tried to compost mortalities? Answer is yes and no, and I think Robin will go through the poll answers at the end of the presentation. So
we're actually doing it right now live, Kim. So I've launched the poll and people are answering.
Go for it. Okay, so let me know. Should I just keep rolling along with presentation or wait for people to answer?
We're polling right now, and we've got 70% yes and 30% no.
Okay, no, that's cool. That's cool. Lots of experience here. I'll have to be more careful with what I say. Okay, so when you're making mortality compost, it takes some effort, but it takes a lot less effort if you make it right the first time. So this is going to be homes on mortality composting. You've got to get it set up right, and then that's going to save a lot of problems down the line, just getting it set up right initially. If you're wanting to, if you don't have good compost, if the compost fails to heat, that's when it's going to start smelling bad. That's when it's going to attract predators, scavengers, coyotes to your compost piles. So if you have bad compost, that's when you're going to make things worse for yourself. And if you go and turn your compost piles and you can see the faces of what you're trying to compost, it's not good compost. It's good compost that has rapid breakdown of the carcasses, so that you can't really tell very quickly. You can't really tell what it is you're even composting. So I'm going to be describing what you need to make good mortality compost, or how to do it through this presentation. And sometimes I talk to people that have tried making compost, and occasionally they're pretty negative. They say, yeah, I tried it. It didn't work at all. It was a horrible mess. And when I've gone out onto their farms to take a look at what they were doing, over here was what they thought was mortality compost, and actually they were taking about 95% mortalities and adding a light little sprinkle of manure onto that, and then calling it compost. And you can see that the failed compost, there's all kinds of bones and flesh, and this would still be good eating for coyotes. They're still going to be attracted. This is not going to smell good. This is a real mess. In compared to, on this side is what a finished compost should look like. It just looks like soil. It doesn't smell bad. There's nothing to attract scavengers. It's a nice fertilizer that you can spread onto your cropland. So first step for making really good compost, the first thing you've got to do is have the right location on your farm for making the compost. And to start, you need some place that you can get into year-round. sheep or any livestock, they never die at convenient times. It's always in the middle of a big rainstorm, snowstorm, something. So you need some place for your compost that you can get into no matter what the weather, no matter what the weather is going to be. And also at your composting site, you need some supplies. You need other things to add in other than just your dead sheep. And I'll go into these a bit later, but you have to have a site where you can be storing a few things at your compost site. You do not want your compost site close to any source of water. There can be some leachate, some runoff from compost piles, and you don't want that getting into your water well or into streams or anything like that. You do want a well-drained site. You don't want a low-lying site so that if it rains, suddenly you're trying to compost in the middle of a lake. That is not going to be a good site for composting. And ideally, you would like some place so that if there is some runoff from your compost, it's going to be contained and it's not going to run anywhere. Definitely, you don't want to be trying to compost somewhere in a pasture with your sheep running through your compost as you're trying to build it. That's a really bad idea. The mortalities, like they're dying because of something, and it could be an infectious kind of a disease. So you don't want your other livestock to be in contact with the mortalities, and it just makes a horrific mess of your compost too. So what kind of equipment do you need? Well, you need a little bit, but not a lot. Most farms should have a tractor. You need a tractor with a bucket that you can use for hauling your other amendments or your mortalities. You also need a stainless steel thermometer, the kind that's used for measuring heating in grain bins, because you do need to know the temperature. Keep records of the temperature of your compost just to make sure everything is working as it should. The overall goal, like what you're actually doing in composting, the things that are doing the work in the carcass breakdown are bacteria and fungi, and they require air. And a few other things, actually, air and a few other things to grow really well and to break those carcasses down really rapidly. And I'll be talking about what sort of some other needs are for composting now. So really, you need to, like, compost is built in layers, and you want to be able to use what you've got on hand. Like it doesn't have to be expensive. If you have some other things that are waste materials on your farm, quite often they can be used in composting as well. So if you've got some old moldy straw, you can use that as the base. Put a layer of mortalities on top that up with a layer of manure. You can add straw on top if you've got lots of straw. That works fine. Or you can use sawdust or wood chips for the base. Put your carcasses on top of that base. Add some more sawdust mixed with manure. You can use things like waste wool, like the tags, the things that aren't saleable. Put that in with your base of straw. Add a layer of mortalities on top that with manure. Like it's just composting is really quite flexible. There's a lot of things that will work. But there's also a few requirements that you have to keep in mind when building it, and I'll get into that right now. So usually the most difficult thing to get exactly right is the water content in the compost. That's often the most challenging thing to get right. So the carcasses are going to have some water in them, and you don't have to worry about that. But the big concern is the things that you're adding to the compost, the amendments, how much water is in the manure, the straw, the wood chips, the sawdust, the grass clippings, the moldy hay, whatever it is that you're using for amendments. So say you're using manure, and you can do something called a squeeze test, where you just take a handful of the manure, put it into your hand, and then just squeeze it. And if you can actually squeeze water out of that manure, it's too wet. Like if water comes out, or sawdust or whatever it is you're using, you can squeeze moisture out of that. Just you're using your hand, that's too wet. If you squeeze it and it doesn't form any sort of, like, won't hold together at all, won't form a ball, then it's too dry. So you can have, if you've got some very dry material, say you have wood chips or sawdust that's really dry, well, the place to put that is at the base of your compost, because you want that as dry as possible, because the base of the compost acts like a big sponge to soak up any liquid that, when the carcasses start breaking down, there is some fluids that are released, and you want that base to be a good sponge to soak that stuff up. And the overall target is 50% moisture in the compost. And if you're really keen, like, you can do some tests in your microwave oven and other things to get an exact dry matter. But generally, I think for most people, just doing the squeeze test is fast and should get you in the right ballpark for moisture. When you're building compost, if you're building windrows, which are just, you can just kind of keep building them as long as you need to build them like they're out in without protection. You need to build them so that the sides, the water is going to run down the sides. It's not going to be pooling on top of your compost. You don't want it to soak in. You also, when you're building windrows, you don't want them too small. Say if you've just got one dead you've got just a tiny little compost pile. That, if it's too small, then it's much more prone to getting wet when it rains, too wet, or drying out too quickly before the carcasses are fully degraded. So it's important to have sufficient mass. You don't want to get it too big. You want to, so that airflow can go through your pile. But too small is definitely a problem. We have done some work with sawdust, using sawdust as the main amendment to put on top of the carcasses, and that sawdust is really an excellent amendment. Like, it's like rocket fuel for compost, but it also tends to dry out a bit too quickly. So if you're using sawdust on top of the carcasses, that can be a problem, because it can dry out too quickly and not fully degrade the carcasses. So the second thing that can cause people problem is not having a sufficient source of carbon in your compost. And that's, at least in southern Alberta, where it's super windy, we worry mostly about the carbon on the base, because anything else is probably going to blow away. So we put a base of straw down, wood chips, moldy grain, whatever it is. Put that's your base, and that's the big carbon source, at least 18 inches thick on the bottom. And the carbon is needed. It's the energy source for the microbes. And so this is some of our old compost data, and this yellow line is carbon, and you can see that as the composting progresses, the carbon's being used up. So it's food for the microbes. Comes up a little bit here. New microbes are growing here at the end, but generally the carbon is being used up through the composting period. So you need to have sufficient carbon to feed those microbes in your compost. The third thing that you need is nitrogen, but this is a little bit easier usually to come by, because there's lots of nitrogen in your dead animals, and also wool is also a good source of nitrogen. So if you've got some really crummy wool that's not saleable for any reason, then composting can also dispose of the wool. Manure is nice as an amendment for composting, because it has some nitrogen. It also has some carbon, but manure by itself doesn't have sufficient carbon to feed the microbes for the amount of time required. So you need to add, other than manure, you need another carbon source in your compost. soil, like people that have ran out of manure and think, okay, they can just scrape a little soil off the bottom of the pen, that'll be okay. That does not work well because the soil just doesn't have, well, it's got virtually no nitrogen or carbon, and so it's just, there's not, that compost tends to not heat well and be less successful. So another thing you got to be considering is oxygen, but if you've got the water content under control, then the oxygen, it pretty well takes care of itself. If you don't have enough oxygen in your compost, that's the number one cause that's got a failed compost. It smells bad, it doesn't heat, it just is a big stinking mess. And that's because your amendments generally are too wet. Or you can have, if you're composting with manure, if you've got big lumpy chunks that are really wet in some parts and it's not uniform at all, so you've got really wet stuff and really dry stuff, that can be a problem too. So if you've got manure that's not very like uniform at all, what we've done is just run it, like not on a field, but just in, not driving through the field and spreading, but just run it through a manure spreader. Have your pile of nice uniform manure just waiting, or more uniform, ready to go for your compost. As I've said, like if you get your compost set up properly when you're building it, that's the key thing to do. Then it's easy. Like once the compost is built, if it's built right, just let it go. You've got to turn it a bit, but your problems are over. So apologize, I've never built windrows with sheep mortalities, so apologize for these offensive pictures of cattle instead of sheep. But if you're building a windrow, and here's your mortalities on the bed of straw, you need to keep some space between the mortalities. If they're touching, the parts that are touching will not degrade. You need to have oxygen going like through your pile, and if they're too closely piled up, it's not going to work. And then you cover the mortalities, and in this case we were using manure, so you cover it with a layer of manure so that you can't see that there were mortalities in the pile, so that's not distinguishable as mortalities. And this is Brian Sexton, who we worked together on composting, and he's a really big guy, so he's like about 6'6". So you need a windrow of compost to be at least the height of Brian to be successful. So to add enough manure, just to have enough volume to keep it from getting too dry or too wet when it rains. So my initial sheep composting, we used a bin, and this is another way to go, but it takes more work. You need to build your composting bins, and you need to have a few different bins because you're going to have compost at different stages. But putting your compost in a bin also gives it some protection until the compost starts to heat. When you initially build a pile, then it's still vulnerable to coyotes and other scavengers coming in because it still smells really like good eating. So bins will provide you some more protection from scavengers, but it's also more investment and work. It's a lot harder to get in here. We had the front so that you could slide that out and then get in here with a bobcat to get your compost out, but it's more work to use a bin, but it gives you more protection. And this is a raised bin so that like there's room for air can come up, like just put one like 2x4 on the bottom here so that air can come up from the bottom as well, which seem to work well. So some other things to consider with composting. How long does it take? About 6 months is enough to fully degrade mature sheep carcasses. If it's just like baby lambs, like you've got a whole compost full of baby lambs, smaller, they'll degrade faster. So the smaller the things are you're trying to compost, the faster they'll go. But if you have a bad setup, if you have initial problems in how you set up your compost, it can take considerably longer to compost. Another thing is turning. You need to turn your compost, mix it in about 6 months. So turn it like about every 3 months to turn it. And it's not, you don't need like a commercial compost turner to turn your compost. All you do is you go in with your bucket and you take the compost off the top of your compost pile, lift that bucket up as high as it can go, and then drop it, drop it into where you're setting up your new windrow, and then the top becomes the bottom and the bottom of your pile becomes the top, and you're dropping it and that gets some air in there and breaks up the chunks and just makes it more homogeneous, which is what you're looking for. When you're done turning your compost, you need to take another layer of amendments, if it's manure or sawdust or whatever it is you're working with, and cover your turned compost just to make sure that there's no little chunks of bone or flesh that are exposed, and just to make sure everything breaks down. You don't want to get too carried away with turning. Some people think, if turning makes things faster, more turning better, but actually if you turn too often, that the microbes are not able to build up a nice community inside the compost, and you can actually slow down the progress of your compost by turning too much. So once in a while is good enough. And you can tell by temperature. The temperature will decline, and then when it's getting pretty low, then you turn the compost and suddenly woof, it'll heat up again. So temperature, if you're looking to control pathogens in the compost, 55 degrees Celsius is kind of the magic temperature that's known to kill a lot of the common bacteria and viruses that may lead to disease. And basically, you're trying to cook your compost. The hotter and longer it can stay, like at higher temperatures, then the faster you're getting the flesh and bone to break down, because the high temperature just means there's more microbes growing. And you can see this compost, nice hot compost, and this is it's first turning, and you can see there's a little bit of straw here, and then there's a few little chunks of bone, but really not too much here, versus this compost, which they didn't use enough carbon in this. They just tried to compost with just straight manure, no other source of carbon, and it didn't heat well, and there's still plenty of flesh and bone, and it's kind of a mess. So hot and long, less bone and flesh all breaks down. So this is just some data from our lamb composter, and you can see it takes a little bit of time for the compost to heat up. It's not like instantaneous, and this would be the time period before it's heated up, when it still smell like tasty treats for coyotes. So this is your danger zone. But once it gets up to like 70 degrees Celsius is about as hot as compost ever can get, because above that, if it gets too much hotter, then the microbes, it starts cooking them as well. So it's a self-limiting process. This is about as hot as it gets, and it goes down, like gradually declines. And then so you're getting down, like once you get down around 40, then it's time to turn the compost. Around 40, it's ready for turning. So next thing, like what to do if you run into troubles. If your compost doesn't heat, doesn't get over, say, 40 degrees within the first few days of construction, you've probably got a problem. And if it smells bad, then it's likely it's too wet. So you got to turn the compost, add some drier amendments. This will not be a pleasant process, because you're going to have rotting, yucky carcasses. But if you can still save it by adding some drier amendments. If it's not heating and it doesn't smell bad, then it's likely too dry. So you need to get some wetter stuff to add in there and turn the compost. Can you compost in the winter? Well, yes, you can, but you need to have piles of sufficient mass. So we got little piles here and a big pile here, and big pile you can see is heating enough that it's really cooking even though it's cold in the winter. So if you've got a bit, you need to have bigger piles to consider composting through the winter. And the other thing you need, like to start a pile in the winter, is you have to have something warm to start the pile. You can't start with frozen manure, frozen carcasses. It's just not going to start heating. You're just going to have a big pile of frozen stuff. So to start a pile in the winter, you need to, like, we have like a stockpile of manure that's already heating, and you put that on top of the carcasses, and we've started piles even at minus 40 and no problems. Everything starts heating up nicely, provided you have something warm to start the pile. So always get questions, what about bones? Well, very important to keep them covered in your compost pile so that they're not exposed to the sun. And if you keep them covered and the compost is heating well and all is well, then most of them should degrade. Shouldn't have too many left at all. And the bones that are left, like you can see, okay, here's the first turn, and there's a bit of straw here still, and some bones. But by the third, like your final turn, there's not much here, just one little bone. And the bones by this time they've lost a lot of their minerals, so they should be pretty soft and spongy. If you pick them up, you should be able to really tell that there's not much there. And if you ran that bone through a manure spreader, should just kind of splinter into a few fragments and not cause you problems. But if you have bones in your compost that get exposed to the sun, then they're not going anywhere. They're permanent. They're like buffalo bones. They're hard and dry, and they're not gonna, you can't compost them. Once they get dried out and exposed to the sun like that, you're stuck with them. I guess you can use them as decoration or whatever. They're not going anywhere. Just to show you how active compost is, we were using galvanized chains to try to pull. We had samples within the compost pile that we wanted pulled out at certain times just to see how well things were degrading, and we started running into real problems. So here's our chains. The first week we pulled things out, oh, no problem. At 56 days, we pulling things out, oh, our chains are kind of rusting. And then after this, we had real problems. The chains were breaking. They were actually, so if you can compost metal chains and break them down, you can compost bones and a lot of things. So compost, the microbial population, it's pretty powerful, actually. So if you're worried about bears or coyotes or whatever it is you've got and don't want to be attracting them to your compost pile, you've got to remember, until the compost starts to heat, it's attractive to coyotes or bears. And you don't want to be storing your dead sheep waiting for that perfect day to build your compost. You've got to deal with them as they appear, and so you keep building or adding onto the compost. Storing deads is going to be a super attractant for the coyotes. And if your compost doesn't work, well, that's really bad. So that smells is going to attract everything you don't want on your farm. And also make sure you're adding in that when you're turning the compost, adding in the layer of fresh stuff on top, just to cover up those bits of flesh and bone, which may still be attractive to scavengers. So conclusions from composting: you can compost year-round. Mortalities, even in Alberta, and even when the mortalities are frozen, that's it. So you can go all around. but definitely it's always, the big thing is how you set your compost up initially. Do that right, you get faster composting, less problems with scavengers. And it takes some time and effort. It's not, it's composting is not completely easy, but it's not that difficult. But unless you're willing to devote some time to it, I wouldn't recommend it. But it is inexpensive because you can take things like other waste materials from your farm, other than the carcasses, things you're trying to get rid of, use those, and can be adaptable to most farm situations. So you can get Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. We've got some composting information available. The BCRC, they came out and took some pictures of our composting site and asked some questions. So there's some more information on composting at their site, or you can email me. I answer compost questions for people like somewhat, so from all over the world. Get emails saying, hey, I'm trying to compost my mortalities, and I'm happy to try to answer. So that's all I have got to say. I will turn it back over to you, Robin.
Hi, Kim. Thank you so much for that presentation. That was great. If anyone has any questions, I'd welcome them now. We don't have anyone has typed in any questions yet, but again, it's just in your web control panel, and there's a little tab that says questions. You can type in your questions there. So we'll give people maybe one more minute here if anyone has any questions to type them in. If not, you're off the hook easy, Kim. Or at least until people start trying to compost and then sending you troubleshooting emails. Okay, well, it looks like no question. Oh, hang on, I got one. Okay, we have a question here. Any advice on burning or incineration?
Okay, burning is actually illegal in most. Burning and incineration are totally different things. And burning, it's really very difficult to get your carcasses fully consumed. And it'll cause like horrific smoke. And if you have really any near neighbors, burning is going to get you in trouble. You will be shut down from burning right away. Incineration, you need to have an incinerator, and most of the incinerators are set up for poultry farms, so they may not be big enough to handle a full-size sheep mortality. You'd have to check out on the incinerator, the box, the size of the incinerator box. Incineration does a really nice job of destroying the carcasses, but it's some infrastructure expense. You need to hook it up to natural gas. It's also going to be really hot. Like while you're using it, you've got to make sure that young children or people are not going to go anywhere around the incinerator, because it is so hot that it would be dangerous if they would touch it. So it's your call. It's nice, clean, and probably easier than composting, but would cost more for the infrastructure to set up an incinerator.
Okay, thanks. We had a second question come in as well. Will wool compost eventually? It seems to be the last thing to go.
For sure. We actually did a study composting waste pelts, like unsaleable pelts, from the lamb plant, and yes, it will compost, but it's the protein in wool, it's fairly, like it does take some time, and you need just good hot compost, but it will go. That when we first started our work composting sheep like sheep mortalities, that was what the naysayers were saying, oh, you're just going to end up with a pile of wool and bones at the end, and it's not going to go. But we found that the wool was gone. The wool was, we really didn't have problems with wool not going. Maybe if you're having problems with wool not going, it could be that you're not got enough carbon in your, because you need to have a balance between the carbon and nitrogen that's in the compost. So my guess would be add in a bit more carbon to your compost.
Okay, great. That was the last question, Kim. So I'll just again take this opportunity to thank you so much for joining us. We're really lucky to have your expertise on the webinar here, and thanks for offering again to do another webinar with us, hopefully next year. So everyone stay tuned for that. So thank you, Kim.
Well, thank you, Robin, for the invitation. It's pretty easy to just stand here in my office and do this.
Great. All right, well, we'll end things now, and I hope everyone has a great day. So thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.